We know that today the world is undergoing an ecological crisis. In fact, this ecological crisis has its roots, as Lynn White Jr. in another one cult classic said, in the Christian approach of the West to entire nature. So the Christian approach to the nature, what they call the Judeo-Christian approach, and I call it Christian approach, removing the word Judeo from it, because we cannot view Judaism through the lens of Christianity. Christianity has a particular lens through which it views Judaism and presents that view of Judaism to us. And this creates a lot of problem. For example, I'll just give one example to make things very clear. In Judaism, the concept of original sin is either almost not there or is a very marginal concept. It is not central. The idea that through blood the salvation can be achieved is not central to Judaism, but it is central to Christian theology. So the point here is we cannot view Judaism. In the center of Judaism, actually there is this beautiful concept of particularly mystic Judaism, this beautiful concept of cosmic tree is there. Tree of life is there. Whereas in the case of Christianity, at the center is this dry, very rectangular, very, very artificial two beams at cross sections. So the point is, you cannot use the term Judeo-Christian, but it is getting used. The same way the word Abrahamic is also having a lot of problems, to which we may deal with that particular aspect at a later session. It is not very relevant, but in a way it is relevant to this particular topic. Here, the Christian worldview is that the entire nature is created for the enjoyment and benefit of humanity. So there is this wonderful way of telling things that why the eggs are egg-shaped, because the eggs are egg-shaped because God created it in such a way that they would be fitting themselves into your fridge. That is why the eggs are egg-shaped. Okay, so this is the kind of view that you have. Everything is created for me. Everything is created for the enjoyment of humans or for the benefit of humans. So why the rabbits are created, why the wild animals are created, most probably they were created so that you can test them in the lab. The bats were created so that you can test them in the Wuhan virus lab. And then you can have coronavirus. That way you will know the love of God. So the point is, this is the way you approach nature in the Christian worldview. Now, this has created an ecological crisis. I will give you another one example. It's a very interesting example. As the modernity was accelerating itself, there were two types of whales. One is called the right whales and the other one is called the sperm whales. The whales were hunted. As you know, whale hunting was a very big business. The whales were hunted. Why the right whales were called the right whales? Because they were the whales which were right to be hunted. So that is the very nomenclature of the whales. The whales would be hunted because they were the right whales to be hunted. So they were called the right whales. So this is the kind of approach they had, the kind of ecological disaster into which we have fallen, all that. So how do we come out of it? Now, you should remember the time in which Hardin's article appeared that Dr. Ankur Kakkar told about. The article appeared in 1968. That was the time when there was the Cold War. There was an ideological war, the kind of a subterranean stream. You have this ideological war, and neither the left nor the right had any idea of how to deal with ecological crisis. So in a way, the left, what they did was they told that these ecological problems and all these kind of things are bourgeois vanity. You are trying to save the bald-headed eagle while a lot of proletariat people are dying on the ground. What kind of concern for nature is this? This concern for nature is nothing but nonsense. So you have to first concentrate on development and uplifting the humans. Later you can worry about bald-headed eagle. So this is the kind of approach that the Marxist camp had. Now, if you look at this very carefully, you will understand that this particular Marxist approach is deep Protestant approach. We have to understand this very clearly. This is the point where the left and the right, they meet together in the West. The Christian fundamentalism and the Marxist doctrine, they meet at a common point, and this is the common point, that the human being is higher, the human being is superior. In fact, the white male is superior to everybody else, to everything else in the existence. So this was the approach of the Marxist Soviet camp, essentially. Whereas in the case of United States, there were again, it was a divided camp. You had people who wanted the ecological crisis to further a kind of a left ideological movement, and there were people who wanted to just not worry about these kind of ecological things and concentrate on profit-making industries. So these were the two kind of approaches again. Now it is in this context that you have to look at Garrett Hardin's article, paper, The Tragedy of Commons. So the tragedy of commons, actually the concept itself goes back to, let us say, Aristotle, 2200 years back. So he told that the one that is being mostly used by maximum number of people gets the least amount of care. So one can say that nobody washes a rented car, right? So that is the kind of approach there was. So if a lot of people are using, nobody wants a particular aspect, then nobody cares about that, whether it is air or whether it is water or whether it is, as I said, rented car or a particular area in which you are using it for recreation. If a particular thing is not owned by people, if it is not owned by the state very strongly, then it is not cared about. Either there should be penalty from the state or there should be profit for an individual person who owns it. Otherwise, it will not be looked upon. So this was the tragedy of the commons. The commons were there, but the commons are not taken care of, because now Hardin argued that now we have come to a particular stage in which the carrying capacity or the tolerance capacity of the commons have been exceeded by the people who are using it. So he gave a very wonderful example. The example he gave was this: in the boundaries, in the frontier regions, if a particular hunter kills a wild buffalo, cuts its tongue for his dinner, which was a very great delicacy for the settlers in United States, nobody is going to tell anything about him 200 years or 150 years before. But now if you are killing a wild buffalo and just for cutting its tongue, people will find that act very disgusting. See from where this particular mindset comes. This mindset comes from, as I said, a Protestant, deep Protestant thinking. So he says, it doesn't matter, the wild buffaloes are kind of sacred animals to the Native American population. They consider these wild buffaloes as having life. They wouldn't just cut a tongue of a single buffalo and leave the entire carcass to rot and go. They would consider it as a sacred animal. Even if they are going to take the food out of that particular animal, they would do it with gratitude. They had this concept that the animal is giving its life for me. I have to make my own life worthy of that particular sacrifice that the animal is doing. It was a kind of divine sacred contract between the animal and the hunter and the hunted animal. So in a way, this very much resonates with the Hindu concept of Rina, where you owe debt to the entire existence. So all these do not have any value for Garrett Hardin. He said that These commons are there, but these commons now, the population is increasing, so these commons are becoming more and more strained, and nobody takes care of the commons. Either the private parties have to take care of the commons, they have to take the entire pasture land, or they have to take the entire water body and they have to take care of it, or the state should take care of it. Of course, Hardin was leftist, so he wanted the state control to be there over the commons. So this is how Hardin viewed the entire thing. Now we come to the next part. In this, we have to look at the particular logic he was talking about. He was essentially pushing for population control. Population control, it was a coincidence or something like that, because the same 1968 Paul Ehrlich came with his famous book, The Population Bomb, in which he predicted a very dire future, and it forms the basis of all our population control programs and everything. So he said that if you want all your other rights to be there, your democratic rights, your right to property, your right to speech, your right to freedom, your right to art expression, everything, you want all those rights to be saved, then you have to curtail the right to reproduce. Now again, you have to understand this very clearly, the politics behind this. So he was telling that you have to control population. This population control would happen only in countries like India, China, and in African countries. So it is not the Anglo-Saxon race that has to worry much about this. The Anglo-Saxon race has spread itself over, let us say, Australia, which is 9 times the size of India. It has spread over entire United States and South America, and it has spread over vast areas of Africa also. So the point is, they don't have to worry about population control. It is the other nations like India, which have not had the expansionist drive, they had to worry about controlling their population. So there was a politics in this population control aspect. Now you have to also give it to the West that they were against this kind of doomsday scenario. One very good example would be, yes, an economist, his name was Julian something, and he made $1,000 bet with Paul Ehrlich. He said that this kind of doomsday scenario is not going to happen. And he said that the human innovation has more capacity to take us away from the doomsday scenario. So he said that let us take 4 scarce resources, precious resources, and let us see whether their prices are going to go up or going to go down. And he said that, Julian said, because of the technological innovations, these prices of copper, nickel, tungsten, tin, they would go down in the next 25 years rather than go up. So these two economists made a bet, and after 25 years, Paul Ehrlich actually lost the bet. So the human innovation was kind of better, more creative, and was working, defying the Malthusian models of doomsday scenario. We have to understand this aspect. Now coming back to the commons. In the case of commons, the next important work would be that of Elinor Ostrom. So she wrote a book in 1990 about something called Managing the Commons. So in this book, she tried to see commons as a kind of systems that were being governed neither by the state nor by individual ownership, neither by socialism nor by capitalism. These are structures that defied both these forms of governance, and they had their own local community support. She almost came with some 8 beautiful principles. So she said that the commons, and she took an organic approach to studying the commons, a very interesting aspect when it comes to an economist. For an economist, it was a very refreshing aspect. She told that if a biologist is to study a very complex process, what she or he would do is take a simple organism and study that process in it, a single cellular organism, and study the process in it. Let us say I want to study photosynthesis, I don't take entire banyan tree. Rather, I would take a single cell with the chloroplast in it and I would study that, and that would be easier for me. So the same way I am studying these commons in small structures, and these small structures are structures from 50 to 50,000 people who are being supported, 50 to 15,000 people who are being supported by this common structure. And she came out with some basic principles. One is that the commons would have boundaries. Second, the commons would be adapted to local conditions. So a particular species that is very important in one set of commons would not be there in another set of commons. What is the central theme of a particular common may not be the same theme for another common managing the same resource. So the commons are adapted to particular conditions. Then even these adaptations, they could be modified by the people who are concerned, the stakeholders. So there is a kind of a participatory interaction, a kind of a proto-democracy, not tokenism in the form of one man, one vote, but rather if a particular person can come out with a serious problem and talk, then he can change the way the particular common is being managed. Then if there are conflicts, then the conflicts could be managed in a very cost-effective, time-efficient ways. And it would be agreed upon by everyone, because there would be a mutual respectability within the people who are managing the commons. Then there would be a penalizing method, a penalizing operation would be there. For example, if you are violating the rule of a particular common, then it is not something like you will be given this particular punishment according to this particular article in the Constitution. Rather, he would be warned. He would be told that, okay, hereafter you cannot do these things. And it would go on and on and on. And if he is again and again doing the same mistake, then he may be excommunicated. So that is how the commons work. Then there would always be a formal system outside the commons. That formal system would have a kind of an organic interaction with the commons. It would recognize the commons to a particular extent. And the commons themselves would be forming kind of nested structures. What are nested structures? If I am to borrow the term from Arthur Koestler, I would call them holons. So these nested structures are like, for example, a mitochondria inside the cell. So it has its own quasi-independence, its own quasi-existence, but at the same time it would be dependent on the nested structure. And the nested structure itself would be dependent on this particular structure. So these commons would also have quasi-nested structures. One can think of the oceanic circles that Mahatma Gandhi talked about in this particular context. So these are the things she talked about. However, these again, they are better than Hardin, and they are way forward from Hardin, but still they are struck with the kind of an Eurocentric model. Let us come to India. In the case of India, we are a nation built on commons. This is something we often forget. Unfortunately, it is the Western economists who have gone into studying the commons, making the word commons very popular, getting the term commons into the mainstream, and then we are recognizing through their work, oh, we had these things already. In a way, it is an embarrassment for us. But unfortunately, our educational system is such that we are like that. At least let us hope that this will give us a framework to study our own structures from our own point of view. And now let us see how the commons have been there in India all the time. And in India alone, the commons have been very seamlessly, in a very beautiful way, woven with the rest of the society. Three important commons would be there. We can talk about three very important commons. One is the grazing lands, and another one are the water bodies, and then you have the forest lands. This we are just taking as examples. Now you take the water bodies. Who owns a village pond? All the communities own the village pond. Who owns the grazing land in the village? All the communities in the world, in the village, they benefited from the grazing land. The communities who were taking care of the cattle, they actually were the managers. They never owned. They were the managers of the grazing land. Who owned the forests? The forest again was not owned, not even by the Maharaja. The forest was not owned by anyone. There were the forest dwelling communities. These forest dwelling communities, they had an exhaustive knowledge of the forest and the resources there in the forest. They created organic linkages with whatever governance was there, under which that particular, into that region, the particular forest was existing. So the forest was kind of semi-autonomous, quasi-autonomous. The communities were there and they were taking care of the forest. The king of that particular area, who was living in the non-forest agricultural urban landscape, they formed a kind of a very healthy organic relation with the communities that were living in the forest. We had a term for this, Vanavasis. So essentially it means communities that are dwelling in the forest. This was changed in the colonial historiography and Marxist historiography into Adivasis, aborigines. This particular term shift is very important because by the term Adivasis, you at once characterize the people living in association with the forest as kind of primitives. They need development. They have to be taken out of the forest. They have been pushed into the forest. So they have been there isolated from the rest of the civilized communities. So they have to be civilized. They have to be made part of the development process. So they have to be alienated from the forest. So to whom the forest belongs? The forest belongs to the state. To whom the grazing lands belong? The grazing lands belong to the state. So the communities that were in the grazing land, they would be thrown out. In fact, Eleanor Ostrom herself studies how the state taking over the forests have actually degraded them in Nepal, in Thailand, etc. How the commons work in areas like, for example, the fishing communities of Sri Lanka. There is, in her work, if you go through the fine print, you will find a very interesting thing. She says that the Jadis, the fishing community Jadis, the Jadis help in social mobility. In the case of India, they would never say that the Jadis help in social mobility. Data would always be there to show that the Jadis are against social mobility. But in the case of Sri Lanka, it was done in 1990s, before all these deep state agendas developed in the Western academia. So they acknowledged that these are the positive roles played by the Jadi networks. Now, Eleanor Ostrom gave a very significant term to the system that governs or the system that manages the commons, and she called it polycentric system. If you think about it, it is a rediscovery. We have this in the form of panchayat systems. So the panchayat systems, if you look at it very carefully, all the communities would have a say in panchayat system. Nevertheless, the panchayat leader would be kind of respected. He would be, his dictate would be accepted by the people. And it would work for the common good of all. But this panchayat system has slowly been degraded. It has been abused by the new polity, by social stagnation. And so the panchayat itself has now become a kind of backwaters of development where all kind of social evils would exist, kind of honor killings would exist. So if you talk about panchayat, the only thing that comes to your mind is a kangaroo court. So that is how we have degraded our own structures. But nevertheless, these structures can be revitalized to help us govern the commons. Now, talking about the communities, as late as, let us say, 17th century, I'm talking about 1645, something like that. How Indians viewed the forest communities. That's very important. How Indians viewed the forest communities. Because the forest communities were the ones that were taking care of the forest resources and making them available to the communities around the forest, the non-forest communities around the forest. So they were doing it in a very ecologically dynamic way. And if you look at the way these forest communities are characterized in the Western literature and Indian literature, you will find a qualitative difference. There was this famous Vaishnavite poet called Pillai Perumal Iyengar. So in the 17th century, 1645, as I said around, he composed a poem called Thiruvaranga Kalambagam. It was in Tamil, Thiruvaranga Kalambagam. So this was about the greatness of Srirangam, the Vishnu who is there in Srirangam. When he was describing all the greatness, he also brings in a very dramatic situation where there is a tribal community. The tribal community chieftain has a very beautiful daughter. The king of the state, he wants to marry this daughter of the tribal chieftain, and so he sends emissaries. They go to this particular chieftain and they talk to him. They are also indicating slightly that the king wants to marry your daughter. It's a very great alliance. At the same time, if you are resisting, there might be a problem. So they are hinting at it. They are not telling it directly. Very, very subtly they were hinting. And the tribal chieftain answers back. He says that, you see, our daughters, they always consider themselves as belonging to Vishnu, who is in Srirangam. And if these temporal rulers try to even come into our territory, into the forest, do you know what happens? Last time such people came, we made such a mess of those people. You see all these cuts, you see what has been on the, with what we have thatched our huts. It is with the fans that these royal kings were using. You know that white royal umbrella that the kings used to hold as signs of their temporal power, we have used it for our welcome arcs. We have just captured them and we have used it. Your crowns, the crowns of your kings, we are using it to measure millets now. So your arrows and your spears and your bows and arrows and swords, we are now using them all as the fence material. So think about it, 1645, you have a poet who was in the court of the king of Madurai. He was composing this song in which a tribal chieftain tells this. Our women use the crown of the kings to measure the millets that we have harvested in the forest. So the kind of respect they had for the tribal communities, the forest dwelling communities. Even down the line, you can see this respect was there. At the same time, they were very aware of all the problems that would happen whenever there is an interaction between the non-forest communities and the forest communities. There is a problem of exploitation, but this problem was understood very clearly. There was one Venkatesh Iyengar from Karnataka. I think he was a Sahitya Academy Award winner. He wrote a wonderful novel called Kakende Kote. Essentially, it means the fort of Kaka. Kaka is the chief of the forest. So it describes how the Mysore king and the forest chieftains, they had a wonderful positive relationship. Whenever it was thwarted by the brokers in between, how they reacted, all these he had mentioned in that. Even today, that particular fort named after Kaka, it exists in forest areas. So this kind of positive things existed. And you take another one community, two communities. One is the Parthis. So the Parthis of Maharashtra, they were forest dwelling communities. When they became criminal tribes, when they started, when the British brought the 1872 Criminal Tribes Act, they were made criminal tribes. It was with the freedom of India that they were decriminalized. So in 1872, there was this Criminal Tribes Act. In 1972, you are having the Wildlife Act. So through the Wildlife Act, what they did, they told that the Parthis can no longer hunt animals. We have this concept of national parks today. In the place of natural forests, we have national parks. So these national parks, what they do, they criminalize all the forest dwelling communities, throw them away. Then they call them scheduled tribes. They give them reservation in all government jobs and everything. But they would be divorced from their original organic linkages. And the entire society suffers because of that. We don't have a system where these people would be given a preference in, let us say, Indian forest services. Why not give preference to the coastal communities in marine colleges, in Coast Guard? So you can use these externals, you can use these commons, you can integrate them with the entire nation, and then you can benefit a lot. The very human ecology itself becomes better. And in the place of all this, there's a kind of Saraswati running without being noticed. There is Dharma running through all our systems. So why you should not go and violate a forest? Because forest is the place where all the divine feminine energies are there, vibrating, reverberating. So from the Rigvedic time of Aranyani to the forest goddesses of today, you have a great respect for the forest. I know this very painfully because in the place where I live, in Kanyakumari district, it was part of the Travancore princely state. There was a Christian missionary here who wrote an account of Travancore called the Charitable State. He was a kind of being, he was giving a left-hand compliment actually. And he described how the East India Company had come here and how they were civilizing us and all that. There, he gives a description of how they went inside and they saw a very beautiful tree in the forest, which all the local communities revered because the tree in itself was very divine. So when he looked at the tree, he was very clear about what should we do with the tree. We should cut this tree and we should make a cross and we should put it in the chapel. So that was his idea when he saw the tree. What he describes, you can get it from archive.org, you will have it, Samuel Mathieu. Next two passages he describes how he brought converted people from outside and he cut the tree. If you read these particular passages and then you go and see the Avatar film in which the sacred tree would be cut right before the native people, you would find it was almost like the Avatar movie had been taken from Samuel Mathieu's account. So here you have an example of how the divine in the forest are taken away. The next problem that we have in recovering our commons is this, and it is the most dangerous thing, that long before this woke and all came up in the West, we have this woke academia here. So you have people like Ramachandra Guha, they are studying the commons. So when they study the sacred forests throughout India, they tell that all these sacred forests belong to the Aborigine culture and this so-called Aryan culture came from outside and then they were destroying these local cultures. So these local cultures, whatever they are there, they are the original native cultures, and the non-forest culture versus supremacist, aggressive, Brahminical, male chauvinist culture that is imposing itself here. This framework is also very dangerous to understand how our commons, because this is not how the bondage, the linkages have been created. The linkages have not been created as one is being subservient to another. Both have been created in equal terms. Just think of the kind of the deceit that has been involved in creating this kind of narratives. For example, Ramachandra Guha again and again takes a very good pleasure in pointing out that Arjuna and Krishna went and burnt the Gandhavana. And this is shown as an example of how the Vedic culture came, and note the point, they would say, including Madhav Gadgil, they say that like the American settlers destroyed the local native cultures there by destroying the natural resources there, these people were destroying. The Aryans were destroying. If so, why is it that it was Indra who comes and fight against Krishna and Arjuna, protecting that particular burning forest? Then again, the same Mahabharata, the case of Dvaitavana, you have the forest animals come and complain to Yudhishthira, telling that, see, you are hunting here and that is endangering our populations, you leave for another forest. So you have very clearly all variety of ways in which a culture interacts with the forest in our culture. You cannot cherry pick a particular thing and essentialize it and then demonize the entire culture, and then create a framework to study the salient features of the culture, thus create binaries. It would actually destroy the very purpose of studying these commons. So we have to develop our own frameworks for studying the commons. What is that particular framework? The framework is based on dharma, punya, runa. I think I have already talked about this particular aspect earlier. In the case of water bodies, I was part of a project called Green Rameshwaram, which was launched by Vivekananda Kendra, Natural Resource Development Project. It is still continuing. I was part of it from 2013 to 2015 or 14. So here we studied the water bodies in Rameshwaram. Think about Rameshwaram now. Rameshwaram is an island in the middle of the Bay of Bengal, surrounded by water, sea water. And they have created more than 70 tirthams or traditional water bodies there. These tirtham, each of these tirtham would be having a special significance for the pilgrims who come there. And these tirthams, whoever created it, they did not give their name to it. One of the tirtham will be called Bhima Tirtham, another was called Sahadeva Tirtham, Draupadi Tirtham, Lakshmana Tirtham, Rama Tirtham, Sita Tirtham, Jambavan Tirtham. So they have given the name of our Itihasa personalities to that particular Tirtham, and they have created a beautiful oral tradition around that particular Tirtham. So the persons would be taking care of it out of the concept of Punya. There was a Tirtham called Runa Vimochana Tirtham. So it is said that if you take care of that particular Tirtham and you take bath in that particular Tirtham, your immediate material benefit is that your Runa, whatever your financial debts that you have, would be removed. At a deeper level, your debt to the entire existence is there. Take care of that particular Tirtham, and that is the way you are repaying your debt to the entire existence. There is another one Tirtham where before taking bath in it, you should donate books to the needed persons. They created this. And what was the thing that was linking all this? What was the thing that was making this system work? It is not these 8 principles that she had talked about, Eleanor Ostrom was talked about. They were there. But the overarching principle was the concept of punya. So you do this, you will get punya. And what is punya? You don't have an English translation for it. So you get punya. The punya goes through generations. Till we respected the concept of punya, these water bodies were functional. After independence, we became rational, within single inverted quotes rational. We became single inverted quotes scientific tempered. Then what happened? These water bodies became endangered. Some of them became extinct. So here you have the commons becoming extinct and endangered everything else was there in place, the concept of punya was taken up. Punya became a superstition, the bodies died. But we had a very wonderful experience when we renovated the bodies after 70 years or at least 50 years. Still the good water was oozing out. So I just think about it, in the middle of an island surrounded by salt water. Centuries later, good water is oozing out of a water body that they have made. So they should have observed how the rainwater pattern is there, rainfall pattern is there, the topography of the area, they have created these commons. So the commons are not just they evolved, they were created, designed, in tune with nature, to preserve nature. And they have been handed over to us, and we have to take care of them. Unfortunately, we have misunderstood the human element associated with it in the form of them being aborigines who are primitive, who have to be cultured, civilized. Then we had the concept of sacredness associated with it. We removed them in the name, telling that they were superstitions. Now we try to reinvent them through the framework of aborigines and supremacist culture that is trying to exploit it, a more typical Marxist, Western, colonial, binary theory. Again, it is also going to fail. If I look at the Indian collaborators of Eleanor Ostrom, for example, one of them was Samatya Sen. Now, you know, if she is going to study the commons, what kind of results she would be getting. So the point is, the Dharmic scholars like us, we have to, each and every one of us, we have to study the commons in and around our own areas and study the cultural, oral, spiritual traditions, sociological traditions, historical traditions associated with these commons, and we have to update and adapt them to the present climate challenges. If we do that, then we will be doing a wonderful service to the nation as well as the entire planet.
And a common pan-India we made for the protection of trees. Randomly, trees are cut somewhere, randomly mountains are cut somewhere.
Your voice is breaking, I think.
Yeah, your voice is breaking. Can you ask your question again?
Yeah. So the question, am I audible right now?
Yes.
My friend, we had a concept, IT concept, where we suggested that.
No, Nikhilji, it's again breaking.
It's just
Nikhilji, you can type your question in the chat box and I can ask it for you.
Yeah, is this clearer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah. So me and my friend, and he's from an IT background, we had a concept where if all the commons be mapped by the longitudes and latitudes online to a common network pan-India, would and then be steps be taken so that they are not encroached upon, mountains are not cut, trees are not cut randomly. Technologically, he said it's very much possible, but then came the question of what the principles and how do we manage, what rules do we apply to these. So, but do you think this is a right approach to reclaiming whatever is beyond beyond our jurisdiction as citizens today?
Actually, documentation at any level, whether it is pan-India level or local level, is very important.
Okay.
And if you can employ the satellite technology and the digital technology, the digital connectivity, and you can create a resource map of all the commons, it is very good. The governance of the commons cannot be done by such a, we can say, a centralized system. The governance will always be through the decentralized community level systems. So these decentralized community networks, local community networks, not even a single community, the local community networks, they will be managing the system, and this larger pan-India map would definitely help. In fact, long before I wrote an article about how the ISRO is creating a very beautiful resource map of India. All the resources you have, the ISRO has published maps. They can be divided into biocultural zones based on the Sangam literature division, like Kurinchi, which is forest, Mullai, which is grazing land, Marudam, agricultural land, and coastal areas are neither. So you can identify these biocultural zones in each and every constituency and give it to the local particular MP or MLA or the people's representative. And that way people can actually approach these commons in a very efficient manner. So yes, it is a possible approach and a very important needed one. Yeah.
Thank you, Arvindan ji. I have a question. If nobody else is going to ask right now, then I can maybe take the initiative of asking a question, which I was always thinking about when you started, talking about this. So I think it's very interesting that neither socialism nor capitalism provides a solution to governance of commons, as you have outlined in your talk. My question is that can we take an example of the education system or governance of education in general as an example of this also commons? For example, like we don't have, the state controlled education, whether it's privatized or it's social left controlled education, neither of that is giving a good solution to us, as we have seen over the last many decades. So my question is education also an example of commons, and is the governance of education also something that can be included in this list of just like environment and forests?
Okay, this is a very important and a very refreshing approach to the entire concept of commons. There are two more things. As you said, one is education. Education can be approached as commons. In fact, that was how the education was. If you look at the way the education was financed, okay, in the case of, for example, in the famous Dharampal study, you will find that that is how it was being financed. It was a common. It belonged to a particular area. So you get the local history. You won't be studying about Akbar, or you won't be studying about even Chandragupta Maurya, but you will be knowing about Vikramaditya, because Vikramaditya is very important to your culture, your way of relating to the pan-Indian consciousness. So you would be knowing about, say, Tulasidas. You would be knowing about the poet saints of Mahabhakta Vichayam, but you won't be knowing about even the Rajput kings or the Mughal kings, but you would be knowing about Prithviraj Chauka. See, the point is, you don't study the history in terms of chronology, in terms of dynasties, but you study in terms of your relevance to your own existence. That is how the educational domains themselves were commons. So commons are localized, commons are having boundaries. So this is how we studied initially. And it created a lot of scholars, a lot of experts, subject experts. So you have physicians who knew about the diseases that are prevalent in your area, and the medicinal herbs that are used, the medicinal formulations that are used in your area. But now that has been removed from us. Now we are rediscovering it because of the pandemic, because of the way the entire system has been inversed upside down. So you are going through, yes, a kind of a churning. And if the government and if the education policy makers make use of it properly, once again we can convert education into local commons. And another one commons that I want to talk about, I left us, the living space. If you look at our original planning, you will find something that Indian villages always had, or Indian even urban areas, they always ended in a kind of a big banyan tree, under which there will be a small platform in which people will be sitting and they will be talking. when we started aping the West, we replaced these trees with water fountains or statues for the leaders. The result was that, what is the purpose of water fountains? In a country like India, if you look at all the water fountains, most of the water fountains are non-functional or they are extracting a heavy ecological cost. But if you are having a banyan tree and a small platform in which people just sit and they relax, you have the social binding, you have a good ecology. So you have both natural ecology and human ecological concerns taken into consideration when you develop something like that. So we have removed these commons. So who was taking care of this banyan tree? Who was taking care of the particular structure that has been developed under the banyan tree? Not the municipal corporation, not the state, it is the community, the village community. So again, when we talk about the commons, we have to look at the kind of commons that we have developed. This is a variety. Again, in the case of India, this is one particular aspect that you always find unity in diversity. The unity manifesting itself in infinite variety of diversity. So the concept of commons also, we can go beyond the conventional concept of commons. So in fact, the term she uses is common property resources, CPR, common property resources. They can't go beyond these concepts, common property resources. We can go beyond and we can look at the tangible and intangible commons. And you have brought out a very wonderful dimension to it. Thank you so much.
There was a passing reference to Gandhiji's oceanic model. Could you please elaborate on it in the light of the commons? That is the first question. And then there are two more questions, but I'll follow that up after that, maybe after you answer this one.
Okay, I will answer. I can see them, thankfully. I will answer all this, no problem. So, Gandhiji, see, one aspect that we have to understand about Mahatma Gandhi in this, the developing thing is that in terms of engagement with the Muslims, Islamist forces, Gandhiji made certain strategic blunders, to which we are still today paying a heavy price. Apart from that, Mahatma Gandhi is one of the most important civilizational voices of Hindutva. Let me tell it very clearly and frankly, he is one of the important civilizational voices of Hindutva. If we are going to talk about dharmic ecology, you have to take Sri Aurobindo and Mahatma Gandhi and Swami Vivekananda and Jagadish Chandra Bose into consideration. So, Mahatma Gandhi made a very strong criticism of the Western model. He told that the Western model is the model of a pyramid. It was a very wonderful insight. Because you look at everything that the West has developed, it has developed only pyramids. Whereas he said, in the case of India, it is an oceanic circle. It is, you have the individual, you have the village, you have the family, you have the village, you have the community, you have the Rajya, and you have the Rashtra, then you have the entire Srishti. So, this model was something that Gandhiji emphasized. He said that these concentric circles are ever expanding. They are not limiting the individual. They are helping the individual to expand himself as everything. So he approached the entire thing from an Advaitic point of view, Mahatma Gandhi, and he told that this oceanic model is the basis of Indian civilization, whereas pyramid is the basis of Western civilization. You have more higher the pyramid's apex wants to go, more broader the pyramid's base has to be. So more the number of people you subjugate, higher will be your civilizational achievements. So you will have colonial wars from Vietnam to Saudi Arabia to Iraq, everywhere, and you will have the moon landing. So moon landing is the apex, and you will have the blood of the Native Americans at the base. So this is the kind of model that the West has, and its achievements are very, very deceiving and eye-catching. So Gandhiji made a very important comparison, contrasting these two. The kind of archetypes he came out with are important for our civilizational discourse. So why is the Protestant approach specifically cited as anthropocentric and not Catholic in Christian theology? The point is, the Protestant nations were more successful in colonization. Number one. Number two, the concept called priestcraft. The concept called priestcraft was a Protestant invention against the Catholic priests and the Jewish rabbis. And then they applied it to each and every nation they conquered. So the shamans of Africa, the Brahmins of India, they all got mapped to this priestcraft. Hence, this particular singling out of this Protestant mentality when it comes to anthropocentric approach to the natural resources. So the entire colonial system, whether you are a Protestant or whether you are a Catholic, doesn't matter, but the entire colonial approach to nature is predominated by the Protestant approach. That is why Max Weber came with the idea of the Protestant work ethics and all that. That is why. So the name of the 17th century Madurai court poet, he was a court poet in the court of Thirumalai Nayaka. His name was Pillai Perumal Ayyangar. Pillai Perumal Ayyangar. The work is Thiruvaranga Kalambagam.
How can one look at the present farmers' agitation from the perspective of commons or a dharmic lens? Are there any good sustainable solutions? And then there's another question in the follow-up, but maybe after this one.
Okay. Well, it is very wrong to call this particular agitation as farmers' agitation. It should be actually called as brokers' agitation. You know? It is by the brokers. So actually the farm laws are helping the farmers to deal with their own produce. So the minute you have started owning the land, you have come out of the commons. Now, if you want to claim back the commons, then you have to claim back not the fields, but you have to claim back the water resources, the water bodies, the grazing lands. And who are owning the grazing lands, who are owning the water bodies? You can ask the state to go out the water bodies. You can ask the state to stop governing the water bodies and the forest lands. But then you have to bring back the communities. You have to empower the communities. You have to empower the original communities that were managing these forests. Unfortunately, we have broken the system. We need a white paper on how this system is right now, and then we have to start working on them. I will tell you another one example. You know, when they were doing this campaigning against the villagers going with their cattle near the forest areas to do the grazing, what they did was they created an image of a cow, a very cow with a skeleton body, non-productive within single inverted course, overgrazing. And they said these cows can overgraze and they can destroy entire vast lands of grazing lands and thus create ecological disaster. They hired students, research students from United States to publish such articles in scientific journals. All this because they wanted the village communities to be kept away from what they called their national parks. We don't want national parks. We want natural forests. If you want natural forests, you should allow the villagers to interact with the forests. So they will bring the cows, they will do the grazing. A tiger may occasionally come and kill a cow. A kind of an equilibrium starts existing between the forest and the village people. This government, by this government I mean the Nehruvian and the Indira Gandhi government, in the name of conserving the nature, they divorced the human communities from the proper interaction with the forest. They created a Cartesian interaction of the state managing the forest. So it is a tremendous. See, the problem with the modern society is this: in 10 years, you can create the destruction that used to be created in 10 centuries. So that is what has been created by the Indira Gandhi's national park movement. Now, to reclaim, we have to work for more than 10 centuries. At least we have to lay out the frame. So it is not going to happen within a day or two, particularly this farmers' agitation. In fact, the entire left agitating for natural resources is the greatest joke, greatest cruel, dark joke.
So, Arvindanji, that reminds me of one of this, the community protection and the community acknowledging their role in this. So Wade Davis, a prominent scholar, he wrote that we cannot protect biodiversity without protecting ethnodiversity. Okay. So until unless, and what we are doing in modern time is just through uniform, urbanization, or not acknowledging the diversity of life or the diversity of ways of living, we are destroying the people who were really the protector of these biodiversities. Okay. So what do you think? How to go and protect this ethnodiversity, which is a part and parcel of biodiversity as well?
See, my answer may be that of a hardcore Sanghi or a Hindutvaite, so you have to forgive me for that. Professor Logesh Chandra once said that theodiversity and biodiversity go hand in hand. He even wrote a wonderful paper on that. He created a list of how the biodiversity and theodiversity work hand in hand. Now, against this, you have monocultures, expansionist monocultures, monocultures of commodities, monocultures of technologies, monocultures of the mind, monocultures of religion. So this, we have to fight against these expansionist monocultures. Now, we have a system that has adapted itself through centuries of challenges. I will give you another one example of a particular community, the Lambadis. Now, the Lambadis, they were grazing communities. They became essential part and parcel of the military strategic work that were being done by the Marathas. So, under the Peshwas, whom the progressive historians love to hate, they recruited 40,000 Lambadis into their armies. And the Lambadis had created I wouldn't say created, I'm sorry. They had their own origin Puranas in which they derived their origin from Sri Krishna or Sugriva and Vali. So the Lambadis, they started emphasizing their Kshatriya identity, but they became criminal tribes. Look at the way our original society was able to, our original culture was able to absorb the changes. We don't know if the Lambadis are originally Kshatriyas, they claim Rajput origins, it could be right. We cannot say they are wrong. Most probably they were right. However, they had fallen into some kind of problematic situation. Again, they were able to come back and the system was able to absorb them, right? So this vitality was there in our system. Unfortunately, we have left out that vitality. Today, what has happened is this. Every jati starts to look at its own share in the power cake. How many IAS officers you have from your jati? How many IPS officers you have? How many judges you have? Right. So this, what it does is, every jati starts to look inward and upward. So it cuts all its relations with other jatis, or the relations, more sadly, the relations get poisonous. They become abusive. Right. So right now, conserving the diverse ways of life, the only way you can do it is by emphasizing the Hindu identity and Hindutva dynamics. That is the only way. At the surface, it may look like it is homogenizing. It is not homogenizing. Because we realize the diversity, now we have to fight a battle to preserve the diversity. When you are fighting the battle, you all have to be at some level homogenized. But once the battle is won, then we can get to our roots and develop the networks. That is more important. Create the networks, and through the networks we can bring back the diversity in a thriving way. This is the only way we can battle, because the enemy is stronger in terms of capital, in terms of his media strength, in terms of his political strength and institutional strength.